Welcome to Discover Vietnam, your journey into the history, people, and epic stories that shape the soul of this resilient land. For nearly a century under colonial rule, the Vietnamese people lived in hardship, oppressed, exploited, and treated as strangers in their own homeland. But this nation never bowed its head. The resistance war against French colonialism from 1946 to 1954 is one of the most heroic chapters in Vietnam's history. A small nation dared to stand up against a global empire, armed not just with weapons but with unwavering patriotism, steel-like willpower, and the powerful strategy of people's war. From the fiery streets of Hanoi during the early days of nationwide resistance to the border campaign and culminating in the legendary victory at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam wrote an immortal anthem of courage that shook the world and changed the course of global history. Join Discover Vietnam as we travel back through time to relive those glorious years and discover why Vietnam won and why we must never forget. On September 2nd, 1945, at Ba Dinh Square, President Ho Chi Minh read the Declaration of Independence, officially proclaiming the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. After nearly a century under colonial and feudal rule, the Vietnamese people, for the first time, became masters of their own nation. It was a sacred, historical moment, marking the victory of the August Revolution, a truly earth-shaking movement. However, the dream of independence had barely begun to take root when the shadow of colonialism once again crept in. France refused to accept the emergence of an independent state named Vietnam and began plotting its return to recolonize the country. So why was a nation that had just seized power forced into a full-scale war? The answer lies in the aggressor's ambitions, their provocations, and, above all, in the patriotic spirit and unyielding determination of the Vietnamese people. After Japan surrendered to the Allies in August 1945, its government in Indochina collapsed. In the power vacuum, the Vietnamese people, under the leadership of the Viet Minh, rose up and seized power nationwide. However, in the post-war world, Vietnam became a chess piece in a game between global powers. In the north, Chinese nationalist troops entered to disarm the Japanese. In the south, British troops occupied Saigon and later helped the French return. In September 1945, French forces followed the British into southern Vietnam. Within months, they had seized many provinces in the south, marking the beginning of their plan to reoccupy all of Indochina. Faced with the threat of war, the newly formed Democratic Republic of Vietnam sought negotiations to maintain peace and strengthen its fragile government. On March 6, 1946, Vietnam signed a preliminary agreement with France, allowing 15,000 French troops to enter the north to replace Chinese forces for a limited time. In return, France would recognize Vietnam as a free state within the French Union. However, France had no intention of sincere negotiation. They saw Vietnam as a former colony to be reclaimed. So after entering the north, they continually violated the agreement. Immediately after entering northern Vietnam, French troops expanded their occupied areas, seized cities, towns, and strategic posts. Clashes broke out with local militias and government forces. Most notably, in November 1946, the Hai Phong massacre shocked the nation. French troops shelled and attacked the city, killing thousands of innocent civilians. This act clearly demonstrated their intent to reconquer all of Vietnam by force. In Hanoi, tension was high. French forces increased in number, set up barriers, took over key locations, and frequently clashed with Viet Minh forces. Civilians lived in fear, deprivation, and growing anger. The Vietnamese government still tried to maintain dialogue. On December 18, 1946, the French issued an ultimatum demanding that Vietnam disband its armed forces and hand over control of Hanoi, an entirely unreasonable and coercive demand. At that point, Vietnamese leaders realized there was no choice but to resist. Peace had been shattered by the guns of colonialism. Without resistance, the independence hard-won in 1945 would be lost, and the nation would again be enslaved. 1. A call from the heart of the nation. On the night of December 19, 1946, President Ho Chi Minh issued the Call for National Resistance. His words became immortal. We want peace. we have made concessions, but the more we concede, the more the French press on. No, we would rather sacrifice everything than lose our country, than live as slaves. This call quickly spread throughout the country. From north to south, people were ready to take up arms to defend the fatherland and their sacred independence. 2. A People's War. The resistance against the French was not just a military battle, but a people's war. The whole nation participated. City dwellers planted bombs, dug trenches, and destroyed bridges to hinder the enemy. Rural villagers built shelters, hid cadres, and produced food and weapons. Intellectuals and artists wrote, composed, and inspired patriotism. It was the power of the people, their love for independence, and the justice of their cause that helped Vietnam survive the difficult early years of the war. For 9 long years, our entire nation lived amidst bombs, hunger, blood, and tears. But we stood strong, we fought on, and we moved forward. Why? Because we refused to be enslaved ever again. The resistance war against French colonialism, 1946 to 1954, was a long and grueling struggle. Vietnam, a newly independent nation, had to confront a powerful adversary, one with superior weapons, a vast economy, and international alliances. Yet the Vietnamese people also had to overcome immense internal hardships: food shortages, lack of weapons, poor infrastructure, and political instability. But it was precisely in these trials that the spirit of the Vietnamese nation shone the brightest. And over time, the strategy of People's War took root and grew stronger, leading to one of the most remarkable victories of the 20th century, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. After President Ho Chi Minh's call for national resistance on December 19, 1946, Vietnam entered war with little to no resources. No air force, weak artillery, shortages of food, medicine, and basic equipment. The People's Army had just been formed, using mostly old Japanese and captured French weapons. Meanwhile, the French had support from the British and Americans, access to modern tanks, aircraft, and ships. The imbalance of power was stark, but what the French lacked was what the Vietnamese had: a deep belief in justice and the united will of an entire people determined to fight for freedom at all costs. In the early stage, 1946 to 1950, Vietnam strategically withdrew from major cities and switched to guerrilla warfare. Fierce battles erupted in Hanoi, Hue, and Nam Dinh before forces pulled back to preserve strength. In rural areas, People's Armed Forces expanded rapidly. Guerrilla fighters, militias, and village defenders operated widely. Every forest, every stream, every village became a fortress. The French could occupy territory during the day, but lost control by night. The strategy of scorched earth and empty houses frustrated the enemy. The deeper the French pushed, the more they were surrounded and worn down. The Viet Bac campaign, autumn-winter 1947. The French launched a massive offensive into the Viet Bac base, the heart of the resistance. Thanks to local support and the protection of forests and mountains, Vietnamese forces repelled the attack, defeating the enemy's plan of a quick victory. The Border Campaign, autumn-winter 1950. A major turning point, Vietnamese forces launched a proactive assault, liberating the entire Vietnam-China border area. For the first time, they broke through France's strong defensive lines and opened the route for international aid from China and the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the war shifted to Vietnam's advantage, with the People's Army launching larger and more coordinated attacks. Throughout 9 years of resistance, life in the war zones and liberated areas was unimaginably harsh. Food and salt were scarce. People survived on wild vegetables and dried cassava. Medicine was limited. Wounded soldiers were treated with herbs and folk remedies. Officials and soldiers lived deep in the jungle, digging tunnels, printing documents, and making rudimentary weapons. Despite all this, a spirit of optimism and resilience flourished. Revolutionary art and music thrived. Poetry inspired patriotism, and though many soldiers fell, the people pressed on. The legendary phrase, digging into mountains, sleeping in tunnels, enduring rain, eating cold rice balls, was no slogan. It was daily life, especially during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu marked the pinnacle of the 9-year resistance. It was a decisive confrontation. The French had built their strongest fortress in Indochina at Dien Bien Phu, hoping to draw out and destroy Vietnamese forces. But they underestimated the People's Army. Troops hauled artillery over rugged mountains, positioned them on surrounding hills, and dug miles of trenches to encircle the base. After 56 days and nights of fierce combat, Vietnamese forces overwhelmed the French and captured General de Castries. On May 7, 1954, the red flag with a yellow star flew over the enemy command bunker, ending the long war and opening a new era for Vietnam. In 1954, in the remote northwestern mountains of Vietnam, a fierce and decisive battle took place between French colonial forces and the People's Army of Vietnam. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was not just a military victory. It was a symbol of the will for independence, the peak of the resistance against French colonialism, and the decisive blow that ended nearly 100 years of colonial rule. The French chose Dien Bien Phu to build an impregnable fortress in the northwest with goals to cut off our supply lines to Laos and Upper Laos, lure our forces into a large-scale decisive battle. However, they underestimated the determination, ingenuity, and the power of people's warfare in Vietnam. Under the strategy of steady attack, sure victory, led by General Va Nguyen Giap, our army transported thousands of tons of weapons and food manually over treacherous terrain, dug hundreds of kilometers of trenches surrounding the valley of Dien Bien, shocked the enemy with the historic pull the artillery up, then pull it back down tactic, never seen before in military history. Not only soldiers, but tens of thousands of civilian laborers, women, youth, and ethnic minorities joined the effort. The entire nation became one united force for freedom and independence. After 56 days and nights of relentless combat, from March 13 to May 7, 1954, the fortress of Dien Bien was crushed. General de Castries and the entire French command were captured. The victory of Dien Bien Phu stunned the world and placed Vietnam among the nations that successfully resisted colonialism. As French journalist Jean Lacouture once said, Dien Bien Phu was not just France's defeat, but the end of an entire era. The victory of Dien Bien Phu stands as the pinnacle of the resistance, a powerful testament to the will of the people and the spirit that nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. Over 70 years have passed, yet the echoes of that triumph still resound, not only in the hearts of Vietnamese, but in all who believe in justice and human dignity. Thank you for joining Discover Vietnam to relive one of the most heroic chapters in our nation's history, when the Vietnamese people rose up against French colonialism with unmatched bravery and determination. The victory at Dien Bien Phu was more than a military triumph. It was a powerful symbol of Vietnam's unyielding spirit and our sacred belief that nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. More than 70 years have passed, but the memory of that resistance lives on, reminding us of the true price of peace and the strength of a people united in purpose. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Discover Vietnam for more inspiring stories, sacred landmarks, and the spirit of a resilient nation.